To be sure, they almost certainly never think of us during their campaigns. But the next president of the United States will have an enormous impact on what happens in this country, too. To debate whether Obama or Romney would be better, not for America, but for Canada, we're joined in the American capital by David Frum, the former White House speechwriter and now contributing editor at the Daily Beast. In the Canadian capital, Sheila Copps, former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada. And here in studio, Theo Caldwell, author and columnist with the Daily Caller, and Alex Swan, communications consultant with the Gandalf Group here in Toronto. And it's good to have you two guys here in the studio, and to our friends in Points Beyond, thank you for joining us in the two capital cities. David, start us off. Let's just get everybody's position on the record here. Who's better for Canada?
I think Romney pretty clearly, and not just because he's more likely to accelerate American economic growth faster than President Obama will, which of course is good for Canada, but I would direct people's attention to two things. The first is President Obama has been very emphatic about his desire to tax American corporations that make big investments abroad. He wants to change American tax laws in ways that would discourage American investment in other countries and encourage American investment in the United States. Well, the biggest single recipient of American investment is, of course, Canada. And so Canada would be the main target of this approach of President Obama's. And the second is, of course, Canada is on its way to becoming one of the world's great energy suppliers, hydrocarbon energy. And if you have a distrust of hydrocarbon energy, as President Obama does, that's going to be bad news for Canada, which has oil sands to develop and which has natural gas to frack for a global market. It's just Canada is not big enough to consume the energy it produces, and it doesn't have the investment resources to finance the energy it could produce.
Sheila Copps, who's better for Canada?
Well, obviously, I believe that Barack Obama is better for Canada because the policies that he have are clearly directed towards ordinary people. If you listen to David's exposition of why we should support his opponent, it's basically to help big business, big business. And I think that what Obama offers is the kind of balance that hopefully will reflect north of the border. When you're looking at, for example, the whole issue of energy consumption and a tripartite or a bilateral agreement on energy, you need to have enough conditions in place to make sure that we have sustainable environment. We can't just simply go ahead and do what's good for big business is good for us. And I think, you know, Mitt Romney's already written off 47% of the population, and that doesn't make for good government north or south of the border.
David, I'll let you come back on that in just a bit. Let me hear from everybody first before we do that, though. Theo, who's better for Canada?
It's the economy, Steve. And if that's what you think is the most important issue, and David alluded to this, then you have to pick Mitt Romney, no question about it. It is axiomatic that Canada and the United States enjoy the largest bilateral trading relationship in the history of planet Earth. And the American consumer represents 70% of the U.S. economy, 20% of the world's economy. And in Canada, we export stuff. We have lots of stuff, rocks, trees, skies, seas, and we send it elsewhere to be sold. We should fall on our faces in this country of Canada every day and thank God that we are positioned where we are with the stuff we have right next to the largest consumer market in history. That pertains to Romney in as much as Republicans, generally speaking, are free traders. They understand that. They understand the value of countries trading with one another and of having, as much as is possible, a free and open trade relationship. David alluded a bit to this when he talked about Obama's desire to discourage international investment on behalf of Americans. Romney understands the value of the trading relationship as it pertains to energy, as David mentioned, and elsewhere. And in general terms, he knows that the trading relationship between Canada and the United States is vital to the interests of both countries. And beholden as he is to organized labor in the United States and other interests, you don't see the same from Obama. It's an open and shut case. It's Mitt Romney.
Alex, you're batting cleanup.
Well, you know, there's my preference, which is, you know, I would prefer the worldview of the Obama administration if it were up to me. And I think if you ask Canadians as well, both Barack Obama, who's an exceedingly popular world leader in the opinion of Canadians, but also the democratic positioning that he represents, is something that Canadians are probably more likely to be aligned with than a Republican administration. But I would hasten to add, you know, one of the important things to consider here is what happens in a transition. The Canadian government has built up relations with hundreds of senior administration officials. There's a relationship which has helped us avoid Buy American provisions. And there's also the fact that the Keystone XL pipeline is assumed to be going ahead under by many under a Democratic administration. I don't think we can get caught up in the ideological differences as much as we have to bear in mind the relationship. And in the midst of the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, for instance, which Canada has worked so hard on, you have to question what happens with a new administration. All that work has to start over again. And so I think people need to be careful about what they wish for on the right.
David, what did you just hear that you want to take issue with?
Well, I'd like to start with what Sheila said. You know, when you're concerned about threats to potential American investment in Canada, that's not a problem just for the potential American investors. The question is, what about Canada? Canadians are workers. Canadians are consumers. And I just think, I can't believe that even Sheila would seriously argue that when an investment occurs, the only people who benefit are the people who make the investment, who may, by the way, also not be rich people, because the biggest investors are university pension funds and insurance companies. But from a Canadian point of view, even if you think, as Sheila does and as Alan said he does, that Obama is better for America, it's quite possible for somebody to be better for America and still worse for Canada. If you may say, gee, I wish Canada had a prime minister who would punish companies for investing abroad and rewarding companies for investing in Canada. But doesn't follow. You then have to say, and I welcome an American president who takes on 10 times the size of the economy or 12 times the size of the economy that same approach. Canada needs American investment. As Theo said, the scale of the energy resource that has to be developed here. And I'm with Sheila Cobbs. It has to be developed in an environmentally responsible way. We need to have a generational commitment to transition away from hydrocarbons. That would involve things like carbon taxes, and I'm for those. But that is not realistically going to happen in the next 30, 40 years. In that period, we're going to need natural gas, which emits half the carbon per unit of energy as coal, and which is, again, expensive to develop. Canada will need American investment, and it will need an American president who understands the transitional importance and enduring importance of hydrocarbons.
Sheila,
and
your
that
turn.
is not Barack Obama. That's Mitt Romney.
Well, I mean, nobody's suggesting that we don't want made in Canada jobs for Canadians, but I think what the thesis that you're putting forward is that because we are an energy-rich country and because the Americans want our energy, therefore Mitt Romney is going to be a better bilateral partner than Barack Obama. I haven't seen it in the past. I don't see it in the future. At the moment, the big question in Canada is whether the Chinese will actually be the chief investors in Canadian energy. We have energy that everybody wants. The Americans obviously are neighbors and friends by proximity and history, and we want to build on that. But I don't believe that the case has been made that Barack Obama is turning his back on Canadian jobs and investment. Where has that happened in the past? And he inherited a situation. It drives me insane that Republicans and conservatives say they manage the economy better when in fact the decisions that we made in Canada on banks, et cetera, we're living to reap the benefits of at the moment. But Mr. Obama inherited a situation that was terrible by 2 successive Republican mandates, and now he's put in the position of having to try and play cleanup, and he's being blamed for stuff that happened under the previous government.
Let me put one issue on the table here that has come up already: energy in general, and in particular the XL pipeline, the Keystone XL pipeline. Mm-hmm. Theo, we're not exactly sure. We know what the Canadian government's position is on Keystone XL. We're not sure what the Canadian people's general position is on that. But let's, for argument's sake, go with the federal conservative position. If you're in favor of that, who's a better candidate for this country?
Mitt Romney. Look, I understand a lot of the environmental arguments have been put forward about finding alternative sources of energy, and actually I appreciate them for what they are. But as much as people might like to have it whereby we power our world with wind, solar, and our own sense of self-satisfaction, we have oil in Canada. It is going to be drilled and is going to be shipped and used by someone. So even if you take every environmental argument there is, you still want the oil that is going to be drilled to go in the safest possible way to the people who use it the most responsibly. Now, as a Canadian, would you rather see Canadian oil go to our closest ally and trading partner, the United States, by pipeline, such that it is, transported in the safest means available, or would like to be shipped across the Pacific Ocean to a malevolent power like the People's Republic of China? And finally, I just say one more thing. Alex made a good point about being practical rather than ideological. The State Department did a 3-year study on the Keystone XL pipeline. And they said, that's fine. They said, a couple of things got to change here, but otherwise that's fine. It was the Obama administration unilaterally, after that study, that decided to block the Keystone XL pipeline. So the work has been done. President Romney, if he were of such a mind, and I believe him to be, could say, fine, let's go ahead with it. And that would be good for Canada, good for the United States, and frankly, good for the environment.
President Obama did, in fact, put the kibosh on Keystone for now. Maybe not forever, but for now. That is a fair point, isn't it?
I think the straw that broke the camel's back was the unanimous vote in the Nebraska legislature. You have the Republican governor of Nebraska whose comment was, or is, that Keystone XL should move us ahead as soon as possible, as soon as a new route is found. I mean, so I don't know how that differs terribly from what the Obama administration ended up doing. Certainly those on the left in the U.S. Were opposed to it, but again, we can't assume that just because the rhetoric or the ideology aligns that we're going to get the best deal possible. And in fact, it was Stephen Harper himself who said, after the rejection of Keystone XL, that we're going to start looking at other markets. And that's going to make it tough for us to meet Mitt Romney's goal of North American energy independence by 2020. They may not be aligned ideologically on the question of pipelines if a Republican administration with the Harper PMO.
And let me follow up on that with David Frump. David, which candidate, in your view, is more likely to get the U.S. off coal and onto renewables more quickly, more efficiently, more effectively?
Oh, well, Mr. Market is going to do that, regardless of who is elected. The United States is having this extraordinary boom in natural gas use. And again, natural gas is not a perfect fuel from a carbon point of view, but it is twice as good as coal. And coal, is, of course, produces more than half the electricity in the United States. As natural gas appears abundant and cheap, you can transition to use natural gas as a way to produce electricity. And that is a tremendous environmental benefit, and it's happening fast. It will happen almost regardless of who is president. It'll maybe a little faster under Mitt Romney, who's favorable to it, less fast under President Obama, who has important constituencies that oppose it. But here's something that Canadians need to understand about their energy. When Canadians talk blithely about maybe we'll do business with China instead of the United States, Canadian energy, and especially Canadian oil, is expensive. Right now, we've had, over the past decade, a period, or since 2005, high oil prices, which has made the Canadian product very competitive. But those prices go down as well as up. They always do. And as natural gas comes on stream, as it becomes possible to use natural gas as a motor fuel, which will happen too, Canadian oil is in danger of being priced out of the market. And that means getting integrated early into transportation networks that can cut the cost of shipping that oil is very, very important. The idea that, well, the pipeline, an XL pipeline, can be built anytime, if you started in 2016 at a time when, or if you propose to, at a time when energy prices are beginning to collapse, the world may say, you know what, China may say, we're not interested in paying for oil that has to be hauled first across the Rocky Mountains and then put in a tanker and pulled across the Pacific, when there's cheaper oil from the Middle East or Indonesia that is right on the water. So just bear in mind that Canada does not, it will not always have as many energy choices as it has had over the past half decade.
Okay, Theo, let me do the follow-up with you, though. My hunch is if you ask most Canadians, who do you think is better on the environment for us, Romney or Obama? They're going to say Obama. David's trying to make the case it's not Mr. Obama or Mr. Romney, it's Mr. Market. But if you ask Canadians, they're going to say Obama's better on the environment. Why would they be wrong about that?
Because, like a lot of things, if you ask Canadians, they think they are predisposed to like the Democrat. But David knows very well, because he's been doing it for a generation. The heavy lifting on the right is trying to convince people that what they think that they have heard, and to think that they know or think they understand about who's better for the environment or for the little guy or for the economy isn't necessarily so. And in this case, if you just walk through it as I did and David did, just in terms of where the energy is going, where the oil is going, where the markets are, and the relative safety even of just taking oil from here to the United States versus here to China, it's pretty straightforward. I think people, they want the best for their country and for the environment, and I think if you're able to give them a minute or two to explain to them precisely what I think we've tried to do, then you get a different answer.
Sheila Copps, do you think the Obama administration has a good story to tell on the environment that Canadians would prefer?
Absolutely, but I mean, the other larger issue, we've spent the better part of the last number of minutes talking about one issue, which is the issue of how we move energy. We have it, they want it. That's one issue. There are lots of other issues that touch Canadians, and if you look at how Mitt Romney ended up in the Republican nomination was by buying into the rhetoric that was coming from the Republican Tea Party. So if you assume that the Republican Tea Party is going to have a fairly significant role in defining his public policy, you're going to be getting into a lot of other issues that make a lot of Canadians very nervous. We had a vote in this House of Commons last week trying to reopen the abortion issue. And if Mitt Romney were elected president in the United States, you can rest assured that that same rumbling would be happening south of the border. People in Canada look at the holistic approach to politics, not just one issue, the energy issue for the economy. And I think David said earlier, that whomever is president, likely the regulatory and environmental considerations will be similar. Maybe the timeframes might be a little bit different, but they're not going to differ that much. So what you want to look at is the big picture issues. Where is Barack Obama on international policy? Is he balanced? Is he fair? Where is Mitt Romney? Does Mitt Romney really understand his constituency? When he said in that self-same interview on the 47% that the only people he ever talks to are Republicans, which is why he needs somebody else to tell him how to capture the balance of that vote. So you're talking about somebody who has a broad life experience, who reaches out to other countries in the world in a way that we haven't seen from recent American presidents, going back to the time of Clinton.
Okay, I'm inferring from the beginning of the former Deputy Prime Minister's answer that she thinks the host ought to move on to some other files that are on the White House Oval Office desk, and I'm going to do that, Sheila. I'm going to take your advice on that. Because yes, obviously we've got a lot more things to talk about than just energy policy or the environment, and you brought up foreign policy, and let's go there. Alex, on foreign policy, which Canadians care about, Romney or Obama?
Well, again, on foreign policy, Canada has worked very hard to get into the Trans-Pacific Partnership negotiations, which have been ongoing.
Take business off the table. Talk about
why that's interesting is because the biggest decisions that Stephen Harper will make in the next 2 to 3 years will involve Asia, and in the U.S. the same holds. And the decisions we make on China, and the decisions that the U.S. makes on China, and what they read into our decisions on whether it's approval of Nexen, the takeover of Nexen by a state-owned Chinese oil company, or whether it's our relationship with China if we get out further ahead of the U.S. on that. That is something that is really going to be devil relations that we have with the U.S. It's the most interesting question.
I hear what you're saying on that.
And the goal for Canada has to be to succeed in both respects. We need good relations with the U.S. We need good relations with China. We're on track now. We have an understanding of where Barack's going in Asia, and we have an understanding and a working relationship on that.
Okay, but hang on. I'm jumping in. Hang on, Alex. Hang on. When the host jumps in, you got to stop talking. Right. On the third time, I'm not talking about business. I'm talking about who is more likely, as Canadians care, to prevent Iran from getting a bomb, to bring peace to the Middle East, if that's even possible. All of it, to do something about Syria. Yeah. Let's look at those files. Theo, who's better?
Well, I don't think you could be any worse than Barack Obama has been, quite honestly. When you look at not just the events of the last few weeks, but his treatment of Israel, of Benjamin Netanyahu, of his apparent insouciance in the face of Iran, as you mentioned, progressing toward a nuclear bomb, the fact that he was utterly silent during early 2009 when the Iranian people, after a stolen election, were protesting in the streets, and the President of the United States, who with a few words could have given encouragement to that movement. And who knows what the benefits might have been, 3 or 4 years later. So in that respect, I think Barack Obama has been a disaster. Yes, I'm aware of their tagline that bin Laden is dead and GM is alive. Okay, what else you got? Because quite frankly, as you have unrest, you have had the Salafist black flag of Al-Qaeda flying over 4 different U.S. embassies in Tunisia, in Yemen, in Egypt, and in Sudan. When you have unrest in almost 30 countries, you have a U.S. ambassador killed. You know something? The foreign policy of the Barack Obama administration has been exploded as a failure. There's no two ways about it.
Okay, you asked the question, what else you got? David Frum, I'm going to put this to you. You got Mitt Romney, who every time he goes on a foreign trip seems to put his foot in his mouth. Do you want to tell us that you think Romney would be better on foreign affairs for Canada than Barack Obama?
It's a big misconception that rests with, I think, probably the Obama administration self-advertising that President Obama has especially cordial relations with other world leaders. I hope Canada paid attention to the fact that when President Obama went to the United Nations on September 25th, he didn't make time to meet with a single world leader, something that hasn't happened in a generation. Aside from David Cameron in Britain,
our Prime Minister didn't even make time to get there.
Well, I can also understand that decision. That decision can make a kind of sense, because if you're not going to have good meetings, then there is a question of why is the Prime Minister going at all. And if the most important meeting of them all is off the table.
So it makes sense for the President to go, but not for the Prime Minister.
The President has a little bit more leeway to decide which meetings he's going to take than the Prime Minister of Canada does, I hate to say.
You got to be kidding.
President Obama has uncordial relationship with the Chancellor of Germany. He has an uncordial relationship with the President of France. His relationship with the many of the leaders of Central Europe and Eastern Europe are very difficult. And so there are the same complaints that we used to hear during the Bush administration of American high-handedness that come about the Obama administration too. So yeah, Mitt Romney did not have his last tour to Europe, which is something you probably shouldn't do during a campaign season when you're not really thinking about those issues that much anyway and are not giving it your best thought. That tour was not successful. But don't allow the Obama people to sell the claim that they have these great international relationships, because they really don't. One last thing. I think Canadians should be paying in foreign policy attention to a lot of possibilities of very abrupt discontinuities. A big slowdown in the Chinese economy with some very scary consequences to happen, and a breakout by Iran, a sudden abrupt change of policy. I mean, we've been on sort of a set of tracks with Iran for a long time, but they may decide not to play along with that and may do something quite dramatic. And you have to ask, who do you trust to be in the commander's chair at a moment like that?
Sheila Copps, what's the answer to that question? Whom do you trust?
Well, I mean, I just think that that Barack Obama has tried to express some balance. I can't believe that David would object to the fact that Barack Obama didn't meet with enough leaders, but it's okay for our Prime Minister not even to go to the United Nations, but to go to a dinner, a fundraising event for one particular country. The reality is that we have to have, in foreign policy, to have some credibility, you have to have some balance. And at the moment, I think Barack Obama has been very strong in sending a message to Iran, and the suggestion that he was responsible for the death of the ambassador, if that's the case, then when the Bush administration presided over 9/11, they should be held responsible for the emergence of Al-Qaeda. It didn't happen under this watch, it happened under previous watches, and obviously it's going to be an ongoing issue of potential terrorism, but at the very least, Obama can go to different parts of the world and continue to speak with leaders with some sense of balance, and not simply that he's siding with one side on an issue that is extremely complex. And I think in the case of Mitt Romney and the Republicans, they are extremely one-sided on their international perspective.
And let me just get Theo Caldwell to clarify his earlier remarks. Were you in fact saying, it sounded like you were saying, and I want to give you a chance to clarify, that somehow the Obama administration was responsible for the death of its ambassador in Libya? Were you saying that?
Yeah. Of course I am. Well, of course I'm saying that.
You're saying the...
Yeah, and the idea that it's sort of it's not related to...
So is Bush responsible for 9/11?
Sorry,
in the same way Bush is responsible
is Bush responsible for 9/11?
Because it happened on his watch?
No, in as much as Libya...
No, not at all.
Sorry, was I interrupting you, Sheila?
Go ahead, Theo.
Because in Libya, which is the country we're talking about, Barack Obama had just been a major part of removing Muammar Gaddafi. In Benghazi, we'd just gone to try to save the people there, and putting in this government they know nothing about, and clearly had no adequate security. And to have an ambassador killed on your watch and then send out your ambassador to the UN to tell everybody, oh, these are just aggrieved movie critics and that's how it happened. Look, it was absolutely, if the buck does stop on the president's desk, the idea that people wouldn't hold the administration responsible for the first death of a US ambassador since 1979 in a country where only months previous the commander-in-chief had chosen to back an uprising to overthrow somebody who'd already given up his weapons program, absolutely.
Okay,
this administration bears responsibility for what happened in Libya.
What do you think Mitt Romney knows about foreign policy? You know it's not his strong suit.
Well, I think he knows considerably more about it than Barack Obama did in 2008.
Based on his years as Massachusetts governor or running companies, or what does he know about foreign policy?
Based on the fact that at least he seems to understand the importance of America's relationship with Israel. He seems to understand in a practical rather than merely rhetorical way the importance of keeping Iran from getting a nuclear weapon. And as I said, as a Republican, he seems to have a pretty broad view of the world and understanding that through comparative advantage, countries like to trade with each other and have good relationships. Barack Obama, had been in the Senate for about 20 seconds and he gets elected president. And now all of a sudden he's an expert after 4 years of a failed foreign policy.
Everybody's had a chance to hit on Obama here. David Frum, I need you to come back now and tell me why you think Romney would be any good at this. So far, he has not demonstrated any ability in the foreign policy field. I understand he's got a story to tell when it comes to domestic economy, but in terms of foreign affairs, where is his track record of success that ought to give Canadians hope?
because I think the biggest bilateral issue that the next president of the United States, whoever it is going to have to manage is going to be the fallout of Chinese economic slowdown. As dramatic as the events in the Middle East are, as consequential as Iran is, if the Chinese economy, which has been growing at 9–10%, which has been slowing this year, if it falls into something, not recession, because that means like below zero, they won't go there, but 4 or 5%, that has huge impacts on the rest of the world. A Romney presidency would be, Mitt Romney has tremendous understanding of currency markets. He has tremendous understanding of American trade relations, and he will, I think, do a better job of, Sheila Copps uses the phrase balance. The United States has an ambivalent relationship to Chinese growth. You don't want, you care about the prosperity of the billion-plus people living in China. You want them to have a better life. China is also an important market for the United States and the rest of the world. At the same time, it's true that Chinese growth past a certain point can threaten to transform global power relationships in a way that none of us, I think, would be comfortable with. So how do you make sure that China does well but not too well? How do you mitigate the fallout from China slowing down? President Obama has always taken the view that there is no problem associated with Chinese economic growth. The more the merrier. And he's also, by the way, just to one last hit on him, remember it was President Obama who in 2008 and 2009 promised a reset on America's relationship with the Muslim world. That didn't happen. I don't blame him for the fact that it didn't happen. I blame him for arrogantly thinking it could.
Okay, let's do less than 10 minutes to go here. And Alex, I want to bring you in and do, I guess, a chapter now we're going to call Man to Man. We don't know who's going to be the next president of the United States. We do know, though, that January the 20th, unless something completely unanticipated happens, Stephen Harper is still going to be the Prime Minister of Canada. Should we assume that it's better for Canada if the leader of Canada and the leader of the United States are both of the same rough political persuasion? In other words, conservative leaders get along better than a conservative or liberal leader would, and therefore, if you care about Canada, it's advantage Romney.
Well, one of the interesting things that all Canadian prime ministers have had to bear in mind is how they will be viewed if they get too close with the Americans. And that's a difficulty that conservative prime ministers here trying to deal with a Republican administration in Washington have to consider. Brian Mulroney considered it and ultimately chose not to pay attention to his detractors on that fact. He worked very closely with Reagan and then Bush the elder and got a lot done, but it came at a price in terms of public opinion. And I think if we get close to 2015 in the Canadian election cycle and Harper is going to have to weigh the consequence of negotiating trade agreements with a Republican administration, and also with an administration that, just on this point about the Mideast, I hear Republicans say this, that there needs to be a tougher approach in the Mideast than Obama is projecting, but I think we remember what that looked like. And I think if the Republicans come in and impose at least just that kind of rhetoric, Canadians will not be comfortable with that, and that's one of many things that will make it hard for Harper to work with a Republican administration.
Let me do the follow-up to Sheila Copps with that. Sheila Copps, I think you had some pretty good front row seats for things like Bill Clinton and Jean Chrétien. Same relative ideology that worked well. Reagan Mulroney worked well. Nixon Trudeau not so well. Kennedy Diefenbaker not so well. It's better when they're the same party, right?
I think that's true. Certainly for the perspective of the Conservatives, I'm sure that the Conservative Party in Canada would hope that the Republicans get in. In the same way, most people who aren't Conservative are probably hoping that it doesn't happen, because if you look at environmental issues, if you look at global warming, if you look at some of the major touchstones of international policy, progress can be made. If you're looking to weaken environmental laws, a Republican and a Conservative administration in Canada and the United States would see that weakness. If you have a difference, in a way, there's some sort of a dynamic opposition that can actually help to bring up the boats in Canada, as it were. If the United States, when Obama came in, the first thing he did was actually name an environmentalist and a brilliant guy to actually head the EPA. He started working hard on global warming. He changed the whole focus of the United States. And in Canada, the opposite happened. So having an American president who believes that global warming is an issue does have a net benefit effect in Canada, because Canadian companies are trying to go after those American alternative energy contracts, etc.
Theo, based on your read of history, better when they're, you can't say the same party because Republicans and Conservatives aren't exactly the same, but generally same corner of the ring?
Nothing ever happens the same way twice. And I've been thinking about that. I was interested in what Alex said about if you're a conservative prime minister in Canada, you don't want to be seen as too cozy with a Republican president. But, you know, it can happen even to left of center politicians in other countries. Tony Blair, as a Labour prime minister in Britain, got a heck of a hard time being called Bush's lapdog. So it's...
Poodle.
Poodle, all right.
Poodle.
Fine, fair enough. I think it's a matter of personality more than anything else. I think when you get in a room and you got two heads of government together, I think it's a matter of how they get along. And I generally can't speak to that between Stephen Harper and Mitt Romney. I will say that neither one is particularly an electrifying personality. As I've said, I think if anyone faints at a Romney rally, the reasons will be purely medical, because they're not really gregarious guys, but maybe they speak a common language. And when I think you get to stuff that isn't really headline news, like major trade issues or whatever, when you speak to just, can I pick up the phone and talk to the guy? I get the sense that Mitt Romney and Stephen Harper would have a rapport in a way that I would suspect is absent between Barack Obama and Stephen Harper.
Well, let me go to David on that. Just based on your knowledge of having worked inside the White House, is it generally better speaking for a country's bilateral relations if the PM and the president are either both liberals or both conservatives as opposed to one of each?
Well, Canada and the United States are not just any countries. The default set on Canada-U.S. relations is excellent. Whenever the relations are not excellent, that's a real deviation and abnormality. So what Jean Chrétien indulged himself on during the Bush years, that was a highly abnormal and I think very irresponsible thing to do. Because the track does not go, you like each other, therefore you get along. The track is, you must get along, therefore you should like each other as best you can, or at least convincingly pretend to. That neither country can afford for this relationship to fall below the level of excellence. And I suspect that Stephen Harper he has a very good relationship with Barack Obama. I know that, and I suspect he will have also a very good relationship with Mitt Romney, because both countries need it to happen. I want to say one thing about how this pertains to the environment, which is that's a point that Sheila Copps keeps coming back to. It is worth remembering the last time there was real environmental progress with the United States and Canada was during the Mulroney and George H.W. Bush years, when the pact was struck that has basically ended the acid rain problem. It's a great advertising myth to believe that Democrats have better environmental records. Typically, they don't. Typically, they don't, because they have criticism from the right. The biggest environmental progress.
Stand by, Sheila. Let him finish.
Let me finish this point, Sheila. Occurred under Richard Nixon, Clean Air and Clean Water Acts, under George H.W. Bush, the Acid Rain Agreement, and I think the Obama administration has been conspicuous for its lack of environmental process, and especially for its jettisoning of any commitment to any kind of action ever on the global warming problem.
Okay, Sheila, your turn.
I think you're right that the acid rain agreement was a fantastic agreement. It also covered a geographic area slightly smaller than New York and Ontario. Global warming is an intricate problem that spans, I mean, we're now getting the negative benefits of the airstream that comes from Eastern Europe. So what's coming out of factories in Russia and the Ukraine actually ends up in the Arctic airspace. So if you want to have a solution on global warming, it has to be a collective, universal solution. And to have a bilateral agreement, I mean, we have the transboundary water agreements, et cetera, et cetera. They can be managed between two countries, but you cannot turn your back on a global problem by saying that you will not sign a global treaty. And I think the issue of global warming is far more complex than single-party agreements like transboundary water issues or acid rain, because that did literally affect a small area between Maine, Vermont, Quebec, Ontario, and it was a small geographic problem.
2 minutes to go.
So
Theo?
it simplifies, too simple.
Even if you believe the direst prognostications about global warming, that we're 6 months away from birds bursting into flames in midair, Barack Obama's proposed solutions, which thank God haven't gone through, of a cap and trade system, for example, would be so disastrous, as Europe can attest, because it is a corrupt, horrible shell game of a situation. As I say, no matter what you believe about climate change, global warming, nippiness, whatever we're calling it nowadays, it would absolutely, the proposed solutions from Barack Obama would be disastrous. And as David said at the top, it's the market that will give us better solutions to help the environment. And Mitt Romney's the guy to make that happen.
Tell me this.
That's not true.
Which one of these two guys in his bones... Hang on. Which one of these two guys in his bones gets Canada better?
You asking me?
Yeah.
I don't think either one of them is particularly about to run out and join a curling team. But if you had to, Pick one, as I say, who understands the value of the relationship. My money's on Mitt Romney. I'm not overly enthusiastic about it, but the guy about Mitt Romney as a person, he's the best available, and he understands the value of the trade relationship, and I think he understands a lot comprehensively.
You know, Romney summered here as a kid near Grand Bend. And that's more than you can say for anybody who's run for that office in terms of their relationship with Canada. It's actually, it's interesting. But
FDR used to hang out up here quite a bit.
Campobello Island, I think it's split between New Brunswick and Maine. But
did he bring his dog? Is that ever? Sorry,
probably. But one thing that's critical, if whoever is in the White House, whoever's in the Oval Office, you have to have a strong relationship with the whole administration, with cabinet secretaries, and I think at various times that's been lacking on the part of the Harper government's efforts. They've allowed distractions to creep into the relationship, which are needless, and unfortunately as well, the relationship got off to a poor start. I think, though, that they have good relations at certain ministerial levels, and if they keep focused on that and they're focused on what is in U.S. interests, they can have a strong relationship in spite of ideology.
And I will continue to look for our first attack ad in the United States on the Canadian issue. I may wait a little while. We'll see. David Frum, it's awfully good of you to join us on the line from Washington, D.C., the former White House speechwriter. We always look for your good comments on the Daily Beast, so thanks so much for joining us. Sheila Copps, the former Deputy Prime Minister of Canada from our nation's capital. Alex Swan from the Gandalf Group here in Toronto. Theo Caldwell from the Daily Caller. Thanks so much, everybody.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.